Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the IS-BAO SafetyNet webinar series today, presented by Polaris Aero on critical tips and techniques for effective change management. Please excuse my voice. I have a little laryngitis going on. I'm Catherine Hilst, the IS-BAO Operations Manager, and just a few quick items. Audience members are on mute today, but we do have a place for you to ask questions. There's a control panel. And you just, it says questions. Go ahead and type your questions in as you think of them, and we'll look at them after the presentation. Today's webinar by Polaris Aero is about the most consistent factor in business aviation, which is change, whether it's adapting to new regulations, integrating new technologies, operating into new environments, or acquiring new equipment and resources. Rather than being a burden, change management affords us the perfect opportunity to maintain our operational preparedness. Remember, no one plans to fail, they fail to plan. This presentation will explore the psychology of change, the basics of change management standards, and provide techniques for moving away from resistance and towards embracement of this critical safety component. Our presenters today are Madeline Young. She's the product manager for Polaris Aero and is responsible for developing the VOCUS product roadmap and ensuring the roadmap is aligned with customer needs, regulatory requirements, and the Polaris Aero vision. She has served as both a safety and compliance specialist for private and governmental entities and holds a master's in advanced safety engineering. And Steve Bruneau is the vice president of aviation services at Polaris Aero, responsible for expanding the company's suite of safety management solutions. Prior to joining Polaris, he was the chief operating officer of Pulsar Informatics, delivering fatigue risk management systems to aviation organizations. He has over 25 years of process consulting experience, helping organizations meet regulatory requirements and achieve new levels of performance. He has a bachelor's in mechanical engineering, a master's in aerospace engineering, and has been leader of 3 successful startup companies prior to joining Polaris. Madeline and Steve, thanks for being here. It's all yours.
Thanks so much, Catherine, and I hope you can be on mute for the rest of the conversation and rest your voice a bit. All right, so I actually want to start with a quote that you just heard Catherine mention from our presentation abstract, right? We know that change is the only real constant in our industry, and we don't always get to choose when or how it's going to show up, but we do get to choose how we respond. So this quote isn't only meant to be motivational, but more importantly, a warning for us, right? Because if we don't prepare for change intentionally, we're leaving ourselves quite exposed to risk. So to make this real, imagine, just for the sake of the webinar today, that your flight department is rolling out a new scheduling software, right? So potentially it's supposed to streamline scheduling and dispatch operations. It's meant to include new pilot notifications and potentially even provide maintenance alerts, right? Super great on paper, but without proper planning, right? Training, testing, even feedback loops, it can turn into confusion, frustration, operational risk, and that's the kind of change that we're here to get ahead of. So it's just one example. Keep it in mind because this will come up a little later. So the questions really that we should be asking are, first, what constitutes a change? So we'll get to that. Are we preparing for change in the right way for us? And how can we adapt our protocols around change to best suit our organization? So before we get into the different types of change, something that we said we would review is a bit about psychology, right? So different types of change trigger formal risk-based processes, right? It's important to pause and recognize that psychology plays a really significant role in how we manage that. We know that there are expectations on us as operators, standards, protocols, requirements, best practices for managing change. So we know that they exist, but it's really easy to overlook the human element, the human side of a change, right? Because at the end of the day, it does affect real people, how we people interpret, absorb, or resist change. And that can either strengthen or undermine our success, depending on how we handle it. So if we treat change like a check the box compliance type of item rather than something that people move through, we risk missing, subtle signs of stress, confusion, operational risk that emerge from how change is experienced, not just what is changing. So I want to take a little bit more of a closer look at this before I move on. As we know, change isn't just a management event, it's a risk event. And that really is defined well in some of the standards and best practices that we'll look at. Resistance to change is usually a signal for us, not a flaw, right? It's based on psychology. So psychologically, people resist change because of loss aversion. In other words, we feel losing control, something we trust, something we feel competent in, even if that new thing that we're changing to is technically better. And that could be anything, right? It could be your scheduling software. It could be a piece of equipment that you utilize, right? It could be anything. So we might recognize at a very high level that the change we're moving through is important and useful and better for the long term, but in the short term, it does cause disruption. It can feel like a threat to someone's routine. It can expose their skills gaps. If it isn't fully understood, it can introduce a lot of uncertainty, or it can maintain the level of uncertainty that exists. Uncertainty plays a really big role in that because in our environment, which are high reliability environments that are low probability of something bad happening, but high consequence if they do, like aviation, predictability can feel like safety. And even more, ambiguity triggers caution. So unless change is clearly explained and operationally justified, people will treat it as a risk, not necessarily a benefit, even if the benefit is obvious or does exist. Then we can add in things like biases, cognitive biases, right? Like defaulting to what's familiar to us, that's status quo bias, or noticing things that only support our comfort or discomfort, that's confirmation bias. All of those things are real problems that we face when we move through change. So this is interesting. On the right side of your screen, you'll see the stages of change model, which shows us that people don't jump into it overnight, right? People move through stages like pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance. Most change efforts launch at the action phase, even though psychologically people are still 2 steps behind in pre-contemplation or contemplation. So think about why and when the idea of a change is introduced to the people that matter. We think that change and we talk about it organizationally, and we expect people to kind of fall in line or support it because this is the operational or organizational decision we've made, but it is also personal to them. And they're the ones at risk too. So the takeaway here is that change will feel like risk unless it's clearly explained why. We acknowledge what's being disrupted in their world, and we give people a role in the process to achieve a sense of cognitive closure. Carl Weick is a thought leader in the world of sense making, and he tells us that people interpret change based on what it means to them. So if we can't give them that closure, we'll fill in the blanks, and our minds can sometimes assume the worst. This is one final slide here with just a quote that I hope that you can refer back to and take away, right? That is, people often say that, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And that's kind of especially true when we're talking about change management. It's not just procedural though, it is psychological. It's not only about new tools, new policies, a change in equipment. It's about how people feel and have to operate differently. Do they trust the process? Do they feel equipped? Do they feel a part of it, not just subject to it? So safety culture is what really helps us determine whether people will speak up if something doesn't feel right, or if they'll feel at risk if something is missed. So consider that scheduling software example that I mentioned, right? Does the team who's being affected, teams, have a way to raise concerns without fear of being judged? Was there room for adjustment based on feedback? Are they actually a part of the process for rolling it out? Right, that's very important for us to be aware of, right? So the need to account for culture isn't just a good practice, right? It's actually reflected in a lot of the guidance and the standards and the protocols and even sometimes the regulations that we are exposed to. So that brings us to, where does change management begin? I always like to start this conversation by talking about ICAO Annex 19. And for those who are unaware, ICAO Annex 19 dates back to 2013, where ICAO took all of the SMS best practices and standards and protocols through all of the different annexes, because that's where they existed, extracted them and combined them into one referenceable annex, which is Annex 19. Part of Annex 19, a big part of it, is Chapter 3 outlines how states, and by that I mean member states under the UN, so that would be like the United States, Canada, Australia, etc., how they're meant to manage safety as a civil aviation authority. But Chapter 4 specifically talks about service providers underneath those states and what their responsibility is. And that is to have an SMS that is built on a standardized framework in Appendix 2 of Annex 19. So we're going to recognize that, or look at that in just a minute. You'll recognize what we have to say. And then also that should be scaled to the size and complexity of your operation. You'll hear us reiterate this throughout our conversation today. That point is so important. But ICAO was very clear. You should have an SMS and it should be risk-based and right-sized in accordance with Appendix 2. And that's what you see on the screen here. If you've never looked at Appendix 2, you can find it online. And the actual appendix for what we're looking at for the framework for SMS is only like 2 pages long. It is not elaborate. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, this is an exact excerpt of all that it has to say on the management of change. And I'll read it for you. The service provider shall develop and maintain a process to identify changes which may affect the level of safety risk associated with its aviation products or services, and to identify and manage the safety risks that may arise from those changes. That gives us a lot of space to navigate. Layer on the fact that this should be in accordance with the size and scope and complexity of our organization. We have a lot of room to work with to make sure that this is really effective for us. The 4 components, 12 elements, there you can see that component 3, element 3.2 is what specifically talks about change management. Now, regulations exist for a reason. So we have our standards from ICAO. That's excellent. It's an excellent reference point for us. And then we move into the regulatory space, right? We know they exist for a reason, and they contribute to that strong record that we uphold as an industry. But the nuance is that while many standards are compliance-based, designed to ensure that you meet a set of defined requirements, the IS-BAO is not, right? That's performance-based. And that distinction is really important because it shifts our focus away from checking the box towards managing safety in a way that actually reflects our unique operation and our personal risk profile. ICAO emphasizes that an SMS should be right-sized, like we talked about, to the complexity and scale of the operation. That means that no 2 programs will look exactly alike. You're expected to align the framework, but how you implement it should reflect the reality of your operating environment, your resources, and your teams. Even with that flexibility, though, there's a key point, and that point is that standards are not the end goal, nor are regulations. They are just a starting point. They are just a baseline, and that gives us the structure to move beyond meeting those expectations to really making our safety management system something that is actually meaningful to us. That mindset is so critical when we talk about change management, because change brings more complexity, and that complexity brings risk. And having a system in place that tailors proactivity and reflectiveness of our current operating climate is what makes the difference between a safe and adaptable operation versus one that moves towards drift in a way that is unrecognizable. So all of that is to say one important point, and that is that your company is already managing change. You may have a formal way of doing that, but you may just not be labeling it in that way, right? So every time you introduce a new procedure or adjust a schedule in a significant way or bring on new personnel or adapt differently to new customer demands, you're navigating change. Naturally, you're probably thinking about that more as organizational and not as risk-based. And that distinction is really what draws us back into change management. When you add on that layer of risk awareness and risk control, that now really labels us into change management, right? This also means that you're already creating safety. Like I said, maybe not formally documented, such as in a change management log or risk register, but in those daily decisions, the workarounds, the waivers, the adaptations that are shaping your safety outcomes. So the opportunity here isn't to start managing change, it's to become more intentional, consistent, structured, informed, and aware of how you're doing it. That's really where risk-based change management shines.
Yeah, so to pick up on Madeline's point here, one of the things that you hear Polaris talk about quite often is that safety management is really business management. And as we talk about change management specifically in today's IBAC webinar, that's always under the safety guise, right? And a big challenge that many of you may have is getting your business leadership to embrace safety and all of the procedures and such that goes into safety. But when you really, and one of the things you hear us talk about is how safety is business in aviation, right? They can't really be decoupled. Almost everything you do procedurally in aviation has a safety implication. And anything you change from a safety implication undoubtedly has a process implication. So it's one of those things that they're really inseparable. So when you talk about trying to get your business to embrace change the way Madeline's articulating it, think about, I'm gonna give you these 2 quick slides to kind of show you the way you want to articulate this to your leadership and your business as a whole. And that is that you're gonna have your company at some level that you consider high performing. And the whole idea is to continue to get better or at least remain at the high performance level. So, and you do that through all of your procedures, your training, and the repetition that your business does. But inevitably what happens is something happens, like Madeline points out, new software. And the result at an organizational level is that that performance level is going to be somewhat degraded. And I put the red X in there because the goal as a business manager and as a business leader is to reduce the likelihood of dipping below the performance line. And if you do dip below the performance line, minimize the time to recover. So it's just like mean time to failure in equipment and mean time to recovery with equipment. Except now we're talking about it at a business level, and change management is all about doing that. So you can see through time as she's mapping out this chart, sometimes it's new software that sets you back a little bit before you benefit. Sometimes it's a new aircraft, new hangar. There's a lot of things that will constantly give you a ripple effect. So as a business leader, doing change management is really intended to give you a different approach. And this next slide that she's going to show you here is the same idea, but if done correctly, when you do have that event, like a new software, you probably will have a little bit of a stumble to some extent. It can't always be perfect, but you don't regress as an operation. And that's the key, is to do it in a way that it minimizes regression. And if there is some regression, you have an ability to recover very quickly. And that way you always have a forward trajectory with all of the changes that you're making for whatever reasons. And that's through the planning that Madeline started to articulate earlier. So Madeline, back over to you.
Right, so the next step, or the first step really in doing all of this, right, is understanding what the change is. What are we actually talking about? Because all that ICAO really gives us is that when something changes that has a risk effect on your organization, right, or a safety risk effect on your organization. So is something like changing your accounting tool going to affect the operational risk of your organization? Probably not, right? So that's something that we could probably just leave to the accounting team to manage from a more business perspective. But there are plenty of things that we might not think about that are affecting risk, and it just really requires us to change our perspective on what that is. So what I've done here is I've taken from ICAO Annex 19, from the IS-BAO, and from FAA Part 5, since that's predominantly where we're located, and I've taken these overarching categories of change that are talked about in a lot of the guidance, and I've organized them for you, right? So according to those references, change management, right? It's not just about major events like adding aircraft or getting acquired by a parent company, right? It includes any change that affects safety risk. So let's look at some of those key categories, and I'm just going to talk down them. The first is operational changes. These include things like, yes, acquiring a new aircraft, or what about this? Having an aircraft of a specific type leave your operation. We don't often think about things that are removed from the operation. We do think about things that are added. So when things are removed, we also have an opportunity to increase risk, because that can increase ambiguity. It can increase a lot of operational confusion. It can increase or maintain equipment that are no longer suited for the fleet that you have, because one of the fleet or one of the aircraft types has been removed from the equation. So now you're actually more exposed to potentially using a tool or a tug or a tow bar or something inadvertently, just as an example. What about operating into a new location? A new base. Maybe now you're going to start operating internationally. Maybe it's to a new international location that you haven't been to, like you've gone to Europe before, but you've not gone to South America, right? Things like that. What about introducing a new flight scheduling system like we're talking about? Here's an interesting point. Even if the goal of the change is efficiency, it touches multiple functions in the organization where there is risk exposure. So that's kind of where we see that tipping point of what Steve is talking about, like an operational change versus one that we do need to manage within our SMS. Even if it's efficiency based, the implications may be risk based. So we just need to maybe broaden our definition of what change means in that term. If something changes your operational rhythm, that's another way that you can look at this too. So maybe it's not that you're changing the location, but you're changing frequency, or you're changing time of day that you're operating somewhere, right? Maybe your executive wants to start departing Eagle at 5 a.m. or arriving, past sundown. Right? Those sorts of changes are going to have a risk implication, could potentially have a risk implication. We need to assess it to understand that. What about personnel and organizational changes? So let's think about key people leaving your organization, or a shift in your organizational structure, especially those people with safety roles. You need to reassess, for example, how authority, communication, and accountability flow. If there's a person responsible for approving waivers and monitoring like flight duty limits, and they are, let's say, leaving the position, and you don't have a clear handoff to that next individual, you're exposed. What if that next individual doesn't have the knowledge and the background that that previous safety officer had for understanding flight duty limits, and now they're responsible for managing waivers and deviation requests around flight duty times? That might not be then the best suited person to take on that piece of the job description, that responsibility. Maybe it needs to go to somebody else. There is risk exposure there. So the qualifications of your people matter just as much as the fact that the individual might be changing. What about a growing organization or a shrinking organization? One that grows might introduce new layers in the organizational structure that might change accountability flow, communication flow, authority flow. Okay? What about procedural or policy changes? If you update your SOPs, your checklist, your fatigue policy, your emergency response plan, your safety management manual, all of those have structural safety implications as well, risk implications. They have to be assessed before implementation. So for example, when your new scheduler changes how fatigue reports are submitted or how duty time is calculated, that's not just an IT change. It's procedural that has an underlying component of risk and potentially even compliance or standardization performance. How about technology and equipment? Obvious things like having a new MEL tracking tool, down to upgrading avionics, using a different logbook system. You may have robust training and rollout plans around all of that, but if SMS doesn't formally assess and document the risk you've introduced, you're missing the opportunity to identify those unintended side effects, like gaps in your workflow disruption, for example. I'd be very curious to know how many of you on the call consider changes in a different department within the realm of safety management of your organization. For example, maintenance operational changes. Maybe they're utilizing a new calibration tool, or a new company that does calibration on your tools. What does the tracking of that look like? How is it changing? How is it affecting their work? You could probably continue those questions down the line to risk implication. How about standards and regulatory-based changes? This one people forget about. So let's say your company is preparing for IS-BAO stage 1, or they're newly subject to the FAA's Part 5 rule for SMS requirements. Those decisions themselves, or those actions now that you have to take or comply with, are major changes. They're not just documentation, but it's about internal engagement, right? Resource allocation, operational shifts, making them change management events by definition is going to help you move through those things more effectively. How about environmental and external changes? These are really, really sneaky because we can kind of see them as mundane or just matter of fact, right? Such as like moving a hangar, switching an FBO, subcontracting maintenance with a different subcontractor, operating into a new country with a different regulatory framework. We might not necessarily think about that at the time of scheduling, right? Are your schedulers even aware that that is something that they need to be aware of, that, hey, we haven't operated into this environment before? So change is everywhere, right? And if we don't recognize the full scope of what qualifies a change, from things that are very obvious, like adding a new aircraft, to things that are much more subtle, we risk falling into a trap of informal adaptation instead of structured management, right? And that's where safety erodes, even in well-run operations. So once you've identified the change, that's step one. The next step isn't just to jump into rolling it out. We have to slow down and walk through the rest of the process. Step two is to analyze the system that's going to be affected by the change. What you see on the screen is just an example of a system description map that we've created just for visual impact. And what this is really requiring of you is to describe what the system looks like now. And by system, I just mean your operation, who's involved, what tools are used, what inputs and outputs exist, and then consider how the change that you're encountering is going to disrupt or impact that setup. So you're looking for areas, right, where risk can be introduced, like we talked about, or where safety margins can shrink. So in other words, before we assess the risk of any change, we need to understand what system that change is actually touching. And that's where the concept of the system description is really helpful, right? It is also a requirement, I use that word loosely, by ICAO and also the IS-BAO framework, right? ICAO Doc 9859 actually makes it really clear that you can't manage what you haven't defined. So just because you're now aware from step one of what the change is by category, the system description then helps you lay out how your organization actually functions, your people, processes, equipment, facilities, and the way that those things interact. It's not just an organizational chart, which it might seem like. It's really a functional map of your operation. So when you introduce that change, whether it's new software, new equipment, a new procedure, personnel shift, you want to refer back to this and ask what parts of your systems are being affected, what are those interfaces, what could get missed if we don't look at this holistically. IS-BAO reinforces that by requiring operators to clearly define their organizational structure, their responsibilities, and their interfaces. So that's a great step forward. It might not use the term system description. We don't see that term used everywhere, but it is starting to make more common appearances. But the intent is really the same, right? You need to understand who's doing what, how information flows, and how the change is going to disrupt that flow. So in practical terms, your system description becomes the starting point for hazard identification. It tells you where risks can emerge, who needs to be at the table to have those conversations, and where you might have gaps that without proper planning could lead to some risky business, so to speak. So yeah, I don't intend to make this seem like it's a documentation exercise. We're really talking about anchoring what you're doing in reality. This is meant to reflect reality. It's a reference that's going to allow you to say that this change is touching scheduling, which interfaces with fatigue, which interfaces with crew resource management, right? It's bigger than just one department, for example. So the bottom line is if you're not looking at your system as a whole and managing change from that way, you silo change, and that's where things can fall through the cracks. So our references that I've been talking about, ICAO, IS-BAO, and even FAA Part 5, CFR Part 5, really outlines this in two ways, right? Understanding your system and then assessing the risk that is introduced. That means that you can't assess what you don't understand. So you have to describe your system first, then identify the hazards that emerge. So one definitely has to come before the other. We talked about the example of changing a software system. I'm going to pop up on the screen just some bubbles that kind of outline areas of your organization that might be affected by that software change. So I have on the right-hand side, our line service, our maintenance department, our customer service, schedulers, dispatchers, our pilots, of course. I've outlined all of our assets because they need to exist in that new scheduling tool. I've outlined caterers, our ground transportation, our safety and security external interfaces. I've outlined our FOM, our flight ops manual, our maintenance manual, our SMS manual. Some of these things, even as I was going through it, as it relates to a change in your scheduling tool, I wouldn't have necessarily thought about ground transportation caterers and my external safety and security providers, but they absolutely do matter, right? Because they're going to have to interface potentially with that system too. Maybe it's even just going to change how your trip brief looks, and that's what you have to give to your caterer and your ground transportation. Those little things also matter. So let's take a different example. Let's take a minor SOP tweak that just needs, a quick hazard review and documented communication to staff, right? That can seem pretty minor, but what is that SOP tweak doing? Who does it affect? What does it affect? Do we need to change potentially how we're complying with an audit standard? Or what other manuals might say that refer back to the SOP that we just changed, right? So you can hopefully see where I'm going with this, right? So the second component to system description, aside from having one and assessing it, is understanding that the approach is meant to be scalable, which we've reinforced with ICAO, the IS-BAO, and SMS Part 5, right? It's meant to be scalable. The guidance is very clear about that. SMS should be right-sized, and that applies to change management too. All right, so bottom line, let's not make change management harder. The goal is to make it safer. And so when we can do a lot of the work up front, like having a system description available to us, so that when we encounter a change, all we have to do is refer back to it as a consistent factor in that process, we're already farther ahead than we would be if we didn't have that description already in place. I do want to focus in on the external interfaces component of the system description very briefly, right? Because this is often overlooked in terms of who is affected outside of my organization. ICAO's Safety Management Manual, Doc 9859, does clearly mention this. It says if an outside entity like a caterer, a ground handler, an FBO, a contract maintenance team can influence safety, they need to be considered as a part of your safety system description. Not just when something goes wrong, but upfront during planning, right? So we're not just talking about notifying external entities when we've had a bad experience with them. We're talking about including them in our change management consideration. The IS-BAO builds on that by encouraging operators to evaluate vendor safety performance, not just price, convenience, or quality of what they do. So we're looking at assessing risk. Are they implementing mitigations? Are they maintaining open communication? Are we maintaining open communication with them and vice versa, especially for frequently used providers? So the point here to this is that external interfaces should be a part of your safety system and your system description, and managing them isn't meant to be reactive. It should be a proactive piece to change management. I wanted to put this up here because this is a great example of how we can start putting all of these ideas into action. What you're looking at is, a system analysis form from the FAA Advisory Circular 120-92 Delta. It's in the appendix at the very end, and it's meant to relate to Part 5, Section 5.53 Alpha and Bravo. That tool is designed to help you analyze a system or a proposed change before moving into the risk assessment. You'll notice it's not just technical, it walks you through operational elements that we've been talking about, right? So what's the function of the change? What environment are we operating in? Who are the people involved? What equipment is being used? What facilities are impacted? So it's really guiding you through looking at your system description if you have one, and if you don't have a system description yet, it's kind of helping you not miss any of those things that you would benefit from if you did have a system description. So here's where it gets important for change management though, is those last two rows, internal and external interfaces. These are those touch points where risk is often introduced, not because someone's going to make a mistake, but because the handoff isn't clear, or the information flow breaks down, or the training is inadequate, or the people don't feel a part of the change. They don't understand it. They haven't been communicated with. Even if they've been communicated with, are they feeling like they're a part of the flow of information that's going to help guide that change to be successful? So the form, this isn't a compliance-based form. It's just meant to be a good structure, a starting point, a recommendation for operators to move through. And as we see SMS Part 5 compliance get move closer to your declaration of compliance date, we're starting to see larger adoption of these sorts of tools. As I mentioned, this one, if you can't see it, there is AC 12092 Delta Appendix B is where you can find that. So whether you use a form like this, or you tailor something like this to fit your organization, or you develop a system description map, the takeaway is that you should start with an understanding, a structured understanding of the systems that a change is going to affect. And that's going to give you a much stronger foundation for a meaningful risk assessment. And that brings us to our risk assessment, right? So step 3, so we've identified what the change is, we've identified how it's going to affect our system. Now step 3 is to assess the risk. We know about risk matrices, so this isn't meant to be a full-blown education session on that, but I'll cover the key points, right? The risk matrix is one of the most practical tools that we have, especially managing change, because it gives us a structure and a consistent decision-making tool about risk. Its purpose, again, isn't just to check the box, it's to actually reveal system vulnerabilities if you use it correctly. So we're looking at 2 things, right? We're looking at likelihood, how probable it is that a hazard or a failure might occur in an interaction in the system, and severity, how serious the consequence would be if it didn't. So for example, right, we've got our scheduling software system that we're rolling out. It's designed to improve efficiency, but early testing might reveal that it actually changes how crew duty times are calculated. That could lead to confusion, potentially ambiguity, missed alerts, even if crew fatigue isn't used in the system correctly, right? Like there are so many layers to this. So we can ask, how likely is that to happen? And if it does, what is the impact? So if we say it's somewhat likely and the consequence is moderate, so let's say, you know, the risk of non-compliance with fatigue limits or reduced alertness in flight, right? That may land us, let's just say, in the B4 box on the matrix. That's a medium risk. It's tolerable, but not something that we can outright ignore. It signals that we need to adopt new controls potentially, like structuring training differently, having dry runs of the system, or staging the rollout with very intentional active monitoring by schedulers and crew and the management team for varying layers of oversight while you gain trust in the system. The value of the matrix, right, is that it gives us that index to help us scale our actions, right? So in this example, we have low, medium, and high risk. Low meaning we monitor and we document. Medium meaning we mitigate, we monitor, and potentially build in some checks around that. High meaning we stop, we evaluate, and potentially even delay implementation until we can really reduce the likelihood or severity of the consequence. Something that's really important about this is that this process gives you a defensible way to justify resources to management and accountable executives. If leadership is hesitant to approve more training time or the software enhancement costs or extra staffing to support a change, or being able to show that the unmitigated risk sits high or in a high medium range, that can really change the conversation that you're having with them. You're not just asking for resources at that point, you're showing, you're demonstrating why they need to be a part of this change, what could happen without the resources that you're requesting, and how they directly support operational safety in their decision making. This ties in directly to what Steve was talking about earlier, right, with how we're trying to keep our performance high above that low performance line. All right, so risk matrix, not just meant to be an arbitrary hazard rating system, right? It does tell us a story, if we use it correctly, of where we're exposed. Some things that you should be thinking about are, when we talk about exposure, when we're assessing the risk of a hazard, what we're interested in is, or a way you can think about it is, what controls already exist that prevent something bad from happening or prevent an occurrence of something from happening? Do we have additional layers of protections later on? So for example, your scheduling software might not currently be accurately identifying flight times and duty times correctly, but maybe, for example, if you utilized flight risk with Polaris, we have additional tools that layer on and can calculate those times for you as well. So maybe that layer of protection would move you from high intolerable risk into the medium level of risk, because you do have certain protections in place, so you're not going to be totally out of compliance. You do have another layer that you can still rely on. That would be one example. Are you accounting for this in training already? Do you have documentation or publications about this already, right? There are just so many layers, so many pieces of our infrastructure that are risk controls that are actively working for us. And what those are matters when we're discussing risk. I want to look at this a little bit differently, right? So once we've assessed the level of risk, the next question is how much room do we actually have to absorb that risk? And that's where I like to introduce the concept of operational margin, right? Because it's that buffer that protects us when work doesn't go exactly as planned. So let's just walk through kind of these next few bullets that I have, right? We've got the black line, that is how work is supposed to be done. What's written in your manuals, your checklists, your procedures, your training, right? All that stuff, the work that's supposed to be done. The blue line is actually how we perform. So sometimes we're a little bit more high performance, sometimes we're a little bit below in terms of performance. We're not always performing things exactly the way they're meant to be done. And that's for a lot of different reasons, right? A lot of factors that are affecting how we actually perform our work on a day-to-day basis. Now, in our world, there's always this potential for a bad outcome that exists. That's somewhere below low performance, right? It's just always looming there. We know that we are in a low probability, high consequence industry, but that probability still exists. Now, when your work is performed, dips low enough and intersects with the potential for a bad outcome, that's when we actually get ourselves into danger and might have a bad outcome. So what we're trying to do is stay within this green space of operational margin, right? That's what gives us room to adjust without getting into trouble. It's where we can absorb pressure. It's where we can improvise. It's where we can still keep things safe even when there's a variable or uncertainty or a vulnerability that becomes exposed. Here's where that connects directly to change management. Whenever we introduce change, whether it's a new tool, new policy, turnover of people, whatever it is, we can accidentally shrink that margin if we're not paying attention. That's exactly what Steve was talking about before, right? With those curved lines. So when we shrink margin, we are kind of putting ourselves in a position where we're naturally going to fall outside of that margin that's comfortable for us and increase our propensity to move towards a potential for a bad outcome. We make assumptions about how things will go, but the reality is always a little bit messier than how we expect things to go. So if we don't evaluate how that change really does impact the day-to-day work, we're going to push that system much closer to the edge, potentially outside of our operational margin limits and closer to the red line where the potential for the bad outcome really starts to grow. That brings us to step 4, which is risk controls. How are we protecting that margin? How are we practically taking actions that create safe boundaries for us, even as the change is introduced and increases our operational complexity? So the next 2 slides here, I just have as just, something visual for us to look at while I talk through the importance of the hazard risk register and your risk control registers, right? So when operational margin starts to shrink, whether it's because of change, complexity, or just everyday drift, we need a way to keep tabs on what could go wrong before it actually does. And that's where your hazard analysis and risk register come in. What you're looking at here is just an example of that risk profile from our software. This is just some demo data for us. And that is where we document potential hazards, rate the risk, the likelihood and severity of that happening because of a change, and decide what types of controls we need to implement. And then when those risk controls are implemented, what does our risk exposure look like then? So each row on the table represents, right, an emerging hazard. We categorize those, by source, by type, and then by impact. And you'll see the color-coded risk ratings on the far right-hand side, which helps us have a nice visual to see if we are and that we are reducing our exposure to risk. This table, though, isn't just meant to be reactive. You're not only meant to look at it after a change happens. It's meant to be a living tool. When you're introducing change, you should be scanning your register for existing hazards that might get worse, new hazards that could be introduced by the change, gaps in mitigations that need to be closed before that change goes live. Maybe we've already done a change recently that has a very similar hazard to the one that we're already trying to adjust, and you might want to go back and review that prior to completing your new hazard risk assessment. It's not meant to be just like a database that you refer to, but an early warning system for you as well. Once we've identified the hazard and assessed the risk, and we've looked at our hazard risk table, the next question becomes, what are you actually going to do about it, right? And that's where the risk control implementation register comes in. So what you're seeing here is our example of a risk implementation register, and this is really that tactical side of change management. It's not just about knowing the risk, it's about assessing actions, tracking progress, and building accountability into that process. Who is responsible for implementing the risk control? What is that control? When is it happening? And are we actually doing it? Is it actually decreasing our operational risk exposure? All right, so you've gone through that process, right? You've identified your change, step 1. Step 2, you've analyzed the system. Step 3, you've assessed the risk. Step 4, you've put controls in place. But then that process for change management isn't meant to stop. What you're seeing here is just a very simple visual representation of that cycle, right? So define, assess, control, but importantly, review. This process, it's really just meant to show that it is a constant loop. It's a constant circle of work that's being done. You should always be reviewing how a change has ultimately affected your system. Don't just implement the change and move on, because how you've controlled for that change has affected your system in a meaningful way, and that needs to be continually reviewed so that you can understand what went well in that process, what didn't go to plan in that process, where did we have to adapt or create workarounds that we didn't initially anticipate? Do we need to revise our system description, update our risk ratings, add new controls into the system? So it's a constant evolution. That's really about planning the change, doing the change, and then checking the outcome, and then continuing. Steve?
Right, so what I want to do a real quick couple of slides here is just kind of bring it back to some simplicity elements. Obviously, a lot of the detail that Madeline just covered is awesome. And if you can take the time to really dig into that, you're going to find that super, super helpful. But sometimes that can feel a little overwhelming. So if you've been to our webinars in the past, we always hear us talk about people, process, and technology. You can advance through that, Madeline. And just I want to use that as a sort of a calling card or a call to action for you to think about how that applies to change management as well. So you can step through all 3 of those. So people, process, and technology, you need all 3 of these things to be effective within an organization to really get the results. So next slide. So when we look at each one of these, the people side of things, how does that apply to change management? Well, right off the bat, you want to understand, who's affected by that change, all the different departments, your internal and external relationships. You're going to go forward and make sure that the training is in place and done appropriately. You want to make sure you have the right resources. Sometimes making a change means you need other skill sets that your present team doesn't have. So do you hire someone, or do you have to get different kind of training for your existing employees? And then as Madeline astutely pointed out, understanding the why, making sure your organization understands why the change is being made will help them embrace it and get behind it and hopefully make it go more effective. The next slide talks about the process side of things. So again, when you think about the processes, you want to think about things like which procedures are affected. And again, the map that Madeline showed earlier is important. Are these internal and or external procedures that are affected? And then moving forward from there, looking at additional procedures. Sometimes changing a process means there's an additional process that has to be initiated, not just a change to an existing one. And then have you tabletop tested that process? Is it well documented and trained? And then to Madeline's system diagram again, changing a documentation denotation here might ripple into some other documents. You need to be mindful of that. And then on the technology side, whether it's software, hardware, equipment, hangars, whatever, what is affected? You need to make sure you understand all those touch points. What other systems do those things interact with? Moving forward from there, we want to talk about the equipment and tooling around your equipment in the hangar and with the airplane. Do you have the right things in that regard? Has that been trained back with your people? And then last but not least is, can it do everything that the former did? Sometimes making a change means that 90% of what you used to do can be the same. It's going to do 20% more, but you might lose 10%. So making sure you understand that when you move forward, you want to make sure that all the things you used to do are covered, and then you're getting the benefits. Being mindful of that is very important. So anyway, I want to kind of give you that people, process, and technology mantra, because that's something that we hammer home all the time. It can actually help you a little bit in this change management realm as well.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So we've got the 4 steps to change. We have Steve's people, processes, technology. We know we love acronyms, so I've put out another one here that might be a good reference point for you for making sure that the change is adopted well, right? Communicating the why, honor what's already working in your system, assess the risk of where there might be gaps, navigate that uncertainty as a team, depending on who is involved from your people, process, technology, or from your system description. Give that structure and that support that we are cognitively desiring, and then evaluate the outcome of that. So I wanted to show this one last time. When it comes to system description, change management templates, really all I wanted to say here is that, like the form I looked at earlier from the AAC guidance, it's really tempting to ask, can we all just do the same thing? Like, where's my checklist for making sure I'm implementing a new aircraft correctly or operating in a new environment correctly? After all, a lot of our operations are dealing with very similar pressures, like or changes like fleet changes, technology, regulatory shifts, operating environments. That's a really fair question. And in many ways, we're more alike than we are different, that's for sure. And we all manage change. We all face risk. We all can absolutely learn from one another. Sharing templates, sharing checklists, opening ourselves to sharing workflows isn't gatekeeping, and we shouldn't be gatekeeping. If anything, it's going to help us accelerate our understanding of our own systems and risk exposure. So there's a balance that we need to strike between not having a one-size-fits-all. Your operation might look similar to someone else's, but your system description might look different than this. And that matters in how you move through change. So my goal here is really just to say that our goal isn't uniformity in how change management is done to the letter. It's intentionality and proving that tailoring your process to your organization is really where our focus should be, not just on looking at our neighbor to see how they're doing it for the sake of, complying with that because they've clearly navigated their change successfully, right? So we have to always consider our uniqueness of our operation as much as we are alike. So final slide here, and then I think we'll have just a few minutes for questions, is just a caution. It's about the illusion of control. In change management, this shows up so much when we assume that because we've made a decision, that the change is done and that now the system is under control. And that can be reinforced when nothing bad seems to happen. But remember, we can't let bad outcomes be the deciding factor of whether or not we're safe, because a lot has to happen before we get to that. So in reality, implementation isn't actually control. Adoption, trust, consistency under pressure, the amount of operational margin we have, that is what really matters. And those things are earned over time. They don't just happen because you rolled something out and seemingly successfully. So I really think that's actually where we want to end off on. I'm going to stop myself here from going on more of a tangent about the illusion of control and maybe open it up to some questions, Catherine.
All right. Oh, wow. Fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. One quick question here that came in was a common excuse me, a common pain point in the business aviation community is determining the point of granularity at which formal change management is required or prudent. Do you have any tips? This seems a highly personal decision.
Yeah, great question, because it is pretty subjective. Steve, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I think the very quickest thing you can do is ask, are there people, process, and technologies that are going to be affected by what's being asked? And then tie it back to the system description for your organization, something along the lines of what Madeline had shown, where you can very quickly see that, oh, if we're going to change that, it's going to touch these 5 or 6 different points. Are we prepared for that? Are we aware for that? Do we have the money for that? And how long is that going to take? And so forth. So I think just right off the bat, will affect people, process, and technology, get to the system diagram, figure out where all the touch points are, and then move forward.
I think something also to be aware of there too is if the level of granularity that you've reached is starting to detract from other pieces of your operation that are important, that's when you need to be self-aware, right? I don't think there's ever going to be a wrong answer for how granular you are meant to go. You could go as deep as you want to go. If you have time and resources, all the better. But there is a balance between managing that change at a level that makes sense, that also allows you to continue operating just as safely because of everything else that you have going on and all of the other pressures, right? If it's starting to drive you away from the ability to closely manage your risk assessments on a day-to-day operational basis, that might be the point in time where you have to assess and understand, okay, we've kind of reached a tipping point here where we need to move on. And it doesn't mean that you can never come back. I think that that's also something important to remember in that whole cycle that we're talking about. The change is never really done. So get done what you feel you can get done, and then you can always come back and revisit that. And you should, absolutely.
All right, well, excellent. That's a brilliant approach to that. Related is a question that says, sometimes we see that decisions are made before the change management implications have been conceived. What's the best way to educate the entire department and leadership on how and when to initiate change management effort via the safety manager and team so that decisions aren't made in a vacuum?
Yeah, I think oftentimes decisions do get made and then the change management uncovers a whole bunch of stuff that no one considered before the decision was made. So I think if you can just do a good job of educating your leadership and the organization of, hey, change has a ripple effect, and make them aware of that, and then come up with, basically a culture where before any changes are made, somebody is asked the question, what's going to be affected? And then using this change management procedure we were just talking about, just do some sort of a quick analysis up front. You don't have to do a heavy change management before a decision's made, but if you can use the map, if you recall, one of the slides that Madeline threw up was an example of getting a new aircraft, how that or a new software, how it trickled through the system diagram. If you can just quickly highlight, hey, this is going to touch 15 different places, and wow, we had no idea it was going to be this pervasive, that might lead to the decision going one way versus another. But if nobody looks at this, that's when decisions get made in a vacuum, and suddenly the change management uncovers this after the fact, and now you're in a firefighting alarm situation, now you're in a budget crunch issue, now you've got all these stresses that are affecting the safety of your operation and effectiveness.
Right. It goes back to that point that we always really try to emphasize. It's just good business, right? Sure, decisions might be made because they have to be made and they're at a higher level than your department is exposed to, and now you have to kind of fall in line. Okay, you can still perform your change management on that after the fact, by the way. And yes, how do you educate on it? Well, it's just good business. It's not good business when you're risk exposed or you have higher exposure and you're at risk of hangar rash or damaging a plane or injuring someone, right? That all justifies this conversation about change management just as much as it does, like Steve was mentioning before, maintaining your high performance above the line. We don't want to be dipping below the line. We know that, and this is a really important and useful tool when trying to communicate with accountable executives and upper management about the significance in incorporating change management and the safety side of things into the conversation as early as possible.
Thank you. Great touch points. What are some of the best lessons learned that you've seen with change management?
I think the why. I think Madeline's point up front about the psychology of
Yeah.
your team. Let's face it, organizations don't make change. The people who work for the organizations make change. So exactly. So if people are all aware of, hey, we're going to do this, and here's what we hope to accomplish. Here's what we think. You might be wrong. Your decision thought process may be failed. But if everyone goes into it with sort of this is what we're expecting, and they understand, and they're trying to be convinced of a certain thing, then at least there's an ability to rally around why you're doing something.
Yeah.
If it turns out it's failed, then well, obviously you have to adjust and do another change management to quickly get back on your feet. But I think that's the biggest thing. People they fail to recognize the people component.
Yeah, and exactly to that point, if I could double down on it, is how and expand it, is how that really significantly affects your culture. We often think about safety culture in terms of reporting engagement, or are they doing their risk assessments, or are they doing their read and acknowledges on time, right? Things like that. Those are all good markers, but this is actually where culture is created, because you're addressing that cognitive dissonance that might exist, or the need for cognitive closure and the need for understanding by individuals. You're involving them in the process, and then you're asking them, how did it go for you? And when we talk about that operational margin is about people, right? This is how people move through work. People have to operate in new areas, in new aircraft, with new equipment, with a change in procedure, under the umbrella of a new safety management software that they have to use, with a scheduling tool that they're unfamiliar with. Those are the people that matter. And so I think when we can look at it through that lens, you start to see really where the benefit is, not just in reducing your risk exposure, but in increasing your safety culture. And I think that that's invaluable. We don't have time to get into it today, but we'll have more discussion on that later.
Fantastic. Excuse me. The last thing, and I think we'll just leave this for your contact information, is a couple of requests for an example of using Vocus to document the change management process. So in the interest of time, I'm going to refer to the contact information you hear, and I know that Steve and Madeline would be more than happy to walk you through that. So please get in touch with them. This session is being recorded, so you'll be able to find it at the link that I've posted to you all on the IBAC website, and that should be up in the next couple of days. Madeline, Stephen, thank you so much for being here. You've really brought some great clarity to this very important question, and the idea of keeping awareness alive, right? Keeping that conversation going. So I look forward to our next session with you, and for everyone else, thank you for being here, and we'll see you on the next IBAC SafetyNet. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.